Great. Thank you all for attending on this delightful 10 a.m. Wednesday, third day of GCAP. I think we've all got good energy going on right now. Unfortunately, this is going to be a very intense, fast-paced talk. So I would encourage you to blank your minds right now and then just kind of collect the pieces you can as we go through it. And if you miss stuff, it's fine. I'll put the slides up online. The talk's being recorded. So before we begin today, I would like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung and Boonwurrung peoples of the Eastern Kulin, the traditional custodians of the land on which we are gathering today, and pay my respects to their elders, past and present. Sovereignty was never ceded. It always was and always will be Aboriginal land. So we're here today to talk about shipping. Who's shipping a game? So you're all in your shipping process right now? Close to it? Late production? Beautiful, good, that's what I want to see in this room. Is anyone here pre-production, early? Anyone like post-release, just kind of doing upkeep? Good, because I know nothing about that. Fantastic. Okay, so what to expect today? I'll have a little introduction. I'll talk about who I am, what the talk is about, what shipping is, what I mean by that. We're going to talk about the impact of a rocky ship. So what happens if your shipping doesn't go so well, what can go wrong, and why you should care about that. Then we have this thing I'm calling the So You Think You Can Ship a Checklist, and this is the bit where it's just going to be like, lots of stuff happening, and your brains are going to be like, I hate this, why'd I come to this talk? But then maybe like, you know, when you get into shipping, you'll be like, oh, I remember this thing from that, and it's just sunk into your subconscious. So that's going to make up the bulk of the talk, and then at the end, we're going to talk a little bit about managing your dragons. So once we've gone through this checklist, there are some items in it. How do I put it? The checklist isn't, you can't like action the things in the checklist. Some of these things are more like warning signs or flags that there could be, it's like about the health of your shipping process. So we'll talk about managing your dragons. So if you do have a kind of like a poor result coming through that checklist, what you can do to deal with that, to make your shipping process a bit smoother. So my hope for this is you'll walk away from this talk with a good sense of where your risks in shipping might come from, and an idea of how you can solve those risks early on, and you can start doing that immediately rather than getting 2 or 3 months from shipping and being like, oh my gosh, or 2 or 3 months from release and being like, oh, something doesn't feel right here. Okay, so why do you care about what I have to say? My name is Cherie Davidson. I'm a producer and a programmer. I've worked in the games industry for about a decade now. I have had the good luck and good fortune of working on many interesting, innovative games that have had both commercial and critical success. So these are a few of the projects I've worked on. You might recognize a couple of them, I hope. Oh, it's misaligned. Let's ignore that. And in this time, because I tend to come on during the shipping process, so people tend to hire me as a contractor to come on, I'm going to say like in the last 20% of development, but really it's like at the point where they're like, oh, we've got to ship the game, let's hire Cherie, she'll help us out. And take the game from kind of that viewpoint all the way through to like the live ready candidate or the release point. Sometimes I leave a little bit earlier because it's kind of like, oh, you're on your way, good. And that has earned me this nickname called the game's midwife. So you're all making these game babies and I'm just kind of standing by the side going, breathe, push, where are the towels? And I have a lot of experience with games that have been delayed and have had kind of rocky ships. I think it's inherent to very creative projects. There's no clear way of knowing exactly how your game is going to come together. There's no formula for the innovative game. Okay, so a warning for this talk. This is not going to necessarily be motivational. You might not come out of this talk feeling really good. The chances are you might come out of this talk feeling a little bit hopefully not terrified, but a little bit anxious. So I want to prepare this and just let you know that's what's going on. And I want to be clear in this talk, I have got my dirtbag producer hat on. Okay, I'm being really mean, I'm being very pessimistic, and there's a reason for it. You need to use that lens to your advantage. So, what is shipping? When I say shipping, basically anything that happens between what we're calling production, so your content is complete, your code is kind of complete, you know what your game is, you've done all your kind of R&D, it's all sorted out, you've got most of your game in place. through to that live ready candidate we talked about. As I mentioned before, I also kind of like this point where people think, oh, I've got to finish the game. I think that mindset shift is really important and really critical to this idea of shipping. And you might hear about people going into like shipping mode and stuff like this as well. Usually we think of it as being reserved for finessing and polishing, and I like to think of it as when the real magic happens. So it's where you have these kind of different components of a game, and suddenly you start to see them all come together and merge, and you're like, oh, this is my game, I get it. It's actually, I think, one of the most beautiful and exciting parts of game development, but it is one of the hardest parts. Okay, so what can go wrong? Or a bunch of things can go wrong. The main one I want you to care about, I mean, all of them are problematic, but the main one is crunch and burnout. You have real potential with a bad ship to harm your team, to harm yourself, and to do just damage that will take years and years to recover from. So that's the main one, but also you'll have a game that launches that is not the quality you want it to be. It'll launch with bugs. That will result in having poor review scores, which then results in lower sales, which then impacts your cash flow. Although cash flow can be both, so marketing can also be impacted by having a poor release strategy, poor marketing strategy before in this shipping process, and your cash flow can be impacted by not having enough money to do a delay or something if you need to, that kind of thing. Unplanned delays can come out of this. The takeaway I want you to take from this is like, if you're going to do a delay, plan it. Like, plan it and do it. Don't wait until it's last minute and then don't have it planned. Like, figure it out early. Worst case scenarios are your studio and your team disbands. If you have plans to disband, that's fine. That's a part of your structure, no worries. But if you don't want to, if you want your team to be sustainable and continuing, and you get to shipping and then you don't have a good strategy for looking after your team after launch, you don't have good scenario planning for your financials, you haven't been looking at what your sales figures should be doing and managing people's health, then your studio will potentially just dissipate because you haven't looked after each other. And there can be permanent reputation damage. So not just in your customers, your players who are playing the game being like, oh, this is a bit pretty buggy, I don't know if I'll play those games again. Your publishers, your platforms, your stakeholders, people who have invested in you, who want to see that you're going to succeed and you haven't pulled through in the way they thought that you would, and it can also happen within the industry itself. So if you have a really rocky launch and you harm people, that will be talked about and people will know, and you will not be able to hire as well as you could before. You will not be able to make the deals you could before. Okay, so big picture, what causes a rocky ship? Number one, hidden information and risks. You need to be able to see where you're going in order to avoid hitting an iceberg, hitting a reef, right? If you can't see what's there, you're probably going to run into it. So as much information as you can gather about the potential risks of a ship in your shipping process for your game, the better. Number two, poor production process and habits. So if you don't have weekly meetings with the team or whatever your processes are, if they're not good, if they're not in a good structure before you get to shipping, so even in pre-production and production, then you're going to have a hard time when you do get into this shipping post-production stage and you're falling back on these old habits. You won't have the capacity to build good habits at that point. You'll be too busy putting out fires. So build these habits early and reflect on them and have retrospectives often. The third major cause is over-optimism and complacency. And I say this with love because I think there is a place for optimism. You need it to motivate yourself. But again, dirtbag producer hat on. It will make you blind to some of the things we've talked about, risks and poor production processes. So you do need to be really critical, and you also need to be able to take off that criticality and go back into a kind of more positive mindset, which is a tricky skill to have, but practice it. Okay, the checklist. I was hoping to have a printout that you could all follow along with, and I'm like, oh, it might actually be a little bit grim. So you're welcome to, if you want to, like, keep a point score for yourself. The total is, I think it's a little bit above 100. I don't have the exact number, but if you want to, like, keep a points tally, you can. Please don't depress yourself if you do. And as I kind of mentioned, this is not necessarily a checklist of items that you can action. Some of them are actionable. You can read it and be like, oh, I can do that immediately. We can just go back to work next week and start doing that. Some of them are not. They're just a symptom of a larger underlying cause, and I do not have time to cover all of those causes in this session. It would be a whole conference of its own, to be honest. Oh, yeah, it's like a fire danger rating. So rather than it being a guarantee, if you get a low score on this, right, so you haven't ticked off all these boxes, it doesn't mean you're going to have a problem, but it means it's very, very likely you will. And likewise, if you get a very good score, it doesn't mean you're not going to have any problems. It just means you've done the best you can to not have any. We can't plan for every single scenario. As mentioned, it's a chunky talk. This is where we're going to get fast. It's going to be boring. It's going to be a lot of bullet points, a lot of lists, not many pictures. Okay, are we ready? We're feeling good? Right on. Okay. So the first thing, time. It's the first thing we think about. Who here has talked to someone at GCAP or Games Week and said, oh, how are you going? When's your game coming out? Who's done that? Right, okay, first thing we say, when's your game coming out? We define ourselves by our time. And for a good reason. It's one of the key variables when we think about producing a game, right? And it is not exchangeable. You can't just, we think about like, oh, time equals money. That's not true. There are things that your subconscious is doing over time, the way that your team bonds over time, those things are irreplaceable. You can't just substitute it for something else. Sure, you can make processes and you can do things to improve it, but it still needs time for many of these things to happen. So it's one of the variables that is the easiest to move, and when you saw those games earlier where most of them had been delayed in some way, that's why. Because time just stretches out every single other variable that you put into your project production. We also think about time as like locking things by release dates and release windows. So, if you know your game has to come out in February for Valentine's Day, then you have locked yourself to a certain time of the year, and then you might also be avoiding things like, AAA season, or you might have other personal obligations or team obligations, things you need to work around. So time effect is kind of, a locker in that way, a limitation. Okay, so our first checklist items, if you're tracking it, you can take a photo, you can just take the numbers down, and I'll upload this later properly as a checklist. So the first thing is, this is a feeling. Thinking about your release window gives you anxiety. Or it doesn't give you anxiety, sorry, this is a positive checklist. Doesn't give you anxiety, you feel good about it, or you feel okay about it. You don't feel panicked about it. Those feelings are important. If you're feeling that, it means there's probably something hidden under the surface that you're not acknowledging. It's that optimism in the way. So if you do have anxiety about your ship date, your release date, examine that, figure out why. Okay, you have a planned release date or window. Great, please do that. If you're at this point, you're thinking about shipping, you should have an idea of where that window should be. And you should also know the risks and the costs of extending past that date. So if things do go wrong, you need to know what is the cost value of pushing that past, pushing past that. Good, 10 a.m. Wednesday. Okay, please, do I have to say, please have a schedule, please? Shouldn't have to say this, but I'm going to say it. Please have a schedule. Include generous buffers. We talked about contingency. If you're in this screen I was talk, they talked about having a 10% contingency in your budget. Same thing with your time. Have really big generous buffers. You don't know what's going to go wrong. Is your schedule updated within the last week? Have you been updating it recently? Right? Don't. It's not a stagnant document. Update it regularly. It changes constantly as your game changes. Everyone on your team should be able to access it. So if you have a schedule that no one can access and nobody looks at, then you're not getting this information from your team about whether that schedule is a problem for them. If you give it and if you put it under their noses and they have that anxiety we talked about, they're like, oh, I don't feel good about this. You need to have a space where they can express that back to you, and then you can work out why that's happening to push out that date or to change the scope of work or whatever else needs to be done. And I like this idea of kind of verifying your schedule both forwards and backwards. So the idea you start from your current point in time, where your game is and what you think you need to do. So you work forwards through time to work out where that schedule's taking you. And then do the opposite, work backwards from that release window you've talked about and go, okay, we've got to have our certification time, our QA time, our localization time, our text block time, or whatever all those different chunks of your schedule are. Work backwards from that and then see if those two things are aligned. It's a good way of kind of not getting too caught up in the like forwards moving only or the backwards moving only. Money, cha-cha-cha-ching. So money is obviously a really big factor. One of the things I think I've probably seen again and again is that the teams with more money have more flexibility. Time doesn't equal money, but money can kind of get you the space to have more time. So if you can find more money, that's fantastic. But when I talk about it, I'm talking about your runway, your capital, your cash flow, all of the things that fall into this. It limits your headcount, your equipment, your access to services and licenses. So if you do have a certain pool of money, think about how you want to use that really wisely and the different ways in which it can be used, because it is one of your most flexible assets. In-kind is not free. So if anyone here is like a director or an owner or doing like some kind of profit share thing or something, in-kind labour is not really free. It has a cost of burnout. It has a cost of goodwill, and it also has like there's I've gone too far. There we go. It has the cost of, like that person still needs to eat every day, right? So there is still a money overhead that goes into that, and there is the potential that there's debts and stuff that come out of it at the end. So it can be a very flexible thing to use, but it's not free. Post-launch overheads, marketing servers, great. Remember those. Forecasting is your friend. So think about what's actually going to happen when you move your runway forward. Got that in this slide as well. So checklist. If you want to get that as a thing, I think there's just one page for this one. So your release date is not set by when the money runs out. If I hear one more person when I'm like, when's your game coming out? Oh, when the money runs out. If I hear that once more, Don't do it. It's a red flag. It's a sign that you haven't planned out all of this stuff. And there'll be more details in the rest of this talk. You have a budget. Have a schedule. Have a budget. It's been updated recently as well, again. It's a financial runway to support your game beyond launch that includes your post-release support, and that can be based on your scenarios. So if your game does really, really well, how are you supporting that huge audience? If your game does really poorly, how much support will you give them? Like, will you fix those bugs you know about, or will you just kind of leave it to slowly die in the corner? So have your varied projections, be really optimistic, be really pessimistic, be flexible about it. Planning for this will mean that when you get to that stage in shipping and in your launch process, you don't have to think about it. The work is done. And likewise, also when it's just servers, like server costs, right? So you think about what all those variables in there. Okay, so time, money, now development. This is the next thing we think about. How complete is your game? Have you actually hit alpha? Have you actually hit beta? It sounds silly to say that, but really, like do those checklists. Are you actually feature complete? Have you locked your code? Have you locked your features and your content? I also think about looking at like to look at the previous processes, so like from prototype to vertical slice, or from alpha to beta, or from vertical slice to production. All of those transitions, how did they go? Did they go well? Because they could be an indicator of that kind of production process maybe having a failure in it, and that will be represented again in your shipping process unless you make some changes. So we talked about feature lock, content lock, code lock. Just that if you should all know what that is, you should all be doing it. You should be making sure your game has stopped being made and it's now being finished. Your game should better be played from start to finish. It's an indicator of that. And as I kind of mentioned earlier on, this is hard to do with experimental games. So I do acknowledge that games where it's a little bit more difficult to really feel the game until you have all the pieces in place. This can be really hard to do, but so long as you've kind of looked at each component and you believe in each of those components and you have it all kind of worked out, when it does come together, it should come together okay. All right, so kind of touched on these a little bit already. Game is playable from start to finish. The game is playable on all shipping platforms. If you're releasing on Switch, please have played it on Switch. Straightforward. Previous stage transitions, I mentioned that one already. And then this is the list of just things that should be locked, okay? So your gameplay mechanics, your level design, your meta mechanics, keeping those things separate, right? Your moment-to-moment gameplay is different to your meta, so treat them separately. Even for a narrative game, that could be things like your save game cycle, how players return to the game, if they do return to the game. Your art, animation, other aesthetic content work, your audio, UI screens, narrative and writing, accessibility features. Please don't tack accessibility features on the end. They're a part of this whole process. They should be happening concurrently with the rest of your development. And your backend systems for things like localization, telemetry, depending on what you're targeting, and also your backend systems for achievements and like platform, console-specific kind of API stuff that you need to do. I haven't worked on many multiplayer games, but I imagine there's some checklist items here for that kind of stuff as well. All right, creative cohesion. So this is one of my favorite ones. We're moving off now kind of the most common ones. Now this is the one I think you can have the biggest impact in really easily. So creative cohesion, for a lot of the teams I join, the first thing I do is like, aside from the time and the money and that kind of basic check, is now, okay, is this team creatively on the same page? Are they all working together? So you want your team to have creative clarity. If they're working in all these separate directions, they're not working effectively. This is a multiplier for all your other variables again. I mean, all these are multipliers, you stack them all together. But if you can get your cohesion better, then your team is more effective, and then you don't maybe need as much time, or you don't need as much money, or whatever else. Poor cohesion can cause burnout, and it hides information. So if it's not only that your game will potentially take longer to make, people will leave the team, people will feel they're not able to meaningfully contribute to this project, and so they will be having a bad time, they won't be effective, and you're, of course, harming people, which we should not be doing. And it can usually be solved with a production process. This isn't true of all teams. There are cases where like the studio structure makes it very, very difficult to address some of the problems. But in my experience, if the team is open for change, then you're able to address this really effectively with production process changes. Okay, so creative cohesion. For any area of the game, there is a clear process of making decisions. So if you need to make a decision about the UI buttons, you need to make a decision about what backend system you're using in your tech. You know who to talk to, or you know what the process is. Is it a meeting? Is it a person? You get it done. Every area has a key point of information, a key point of contact, or an area owner, which is formalized in documentation. So it's not just, oh yeah, Jerry looks after that. It's like, no, it's written down. You can see it in the Slack. You can see it in your, whatever you use for documentation, your Confluence. And those ideas, skip. Team members regularly suggest ideas or solutions. So when you have meetings or if asynchronously on Slack, team members feel comfortable and safe suggesting creative ideas or solutions to problems. Those problems are regularly implemented. So whoever is the decision maker sees those, thinks about them, and implements them. And sometimes when they don't get done, of course, not every idea is good, the team member who suggested it understands why that wasn't good. This isn't just about the health of that person suggesting it. All this information helps that person understand what the game is. If you suggest something and you find out it's not the right thing, then you'll now understand better what the game is and why that wasn't the right suggestion. Meetings usually have clear goals, and those goals are usually met. It's kind of a production-y thing, but I think it's also a sign that the team is able to kind of focus on what they need to get done rather than kind of scattering across lots of different things, which might be a sign of unclear ownership or something. And all of those meeting notes and decisions are clearly tracked, so you know when decisions are made. You don't go back over there again multiple times. Sorry, I've got a really jittery finger. I'm getting really into this talk now. Directors and decision makers regularly play and review the game. Please. If you're making a game, play the game. And team members, so maybe people who aren't in a direction role, still play the game regularly. They play it either as a group. So I'm a really big fan of having a whole team play the game as a group. I think it's a really great activity to do regularly. Or they play it separately and they have a space to talk about it. If you don't do that, then you don't get those ideas we talked about. Where do they go? Where do they come from? Okay. Team health and safety. How are we feeling, by the way? You're like, whew. Yeah, okay, good. Am I going too fast, too slow? Right on. Okay, good. I think for time, I'm probably okay for time, I think. Team health and safety. This is really important. This is kind of the flip side of creative cohesion. So creative cohesion is creatively, how's it going? And then team health and safety is, how's your culture going, and how is that working together, and are your people feeling safe and comfortable and able to work on the game effectively? So I really like this quote that's a bastardization of, I think it's a Isaac Asimov quote about magic and technology. Any sufficiently advanced negligence is indistinguishable from malice. So even if you want to run the best company in the world and you have the best intentions, if you are not aware of this, if you're not seeing these risks that exist, you will be unintentionally harming someone. So keep that in mind. Your intentions are great, keep them, but that's not all you need. You need more than that. And this is particularly one of the areas of this talk where, there are some checklist things in here, but a bunch of these are just warning signs. And to talk more in detail about this is multiple other talks. It's a whole other conference. Okay, so number one, there's an up-to-date team handbook. Who has a team handbook? Yeah, good, okay, a couple of you, great, all right. There should be everybody, but it's all right, we'll take our wins. Team members regularly give back on production processes and studio culture, so just like the previous area, but this is about your studio culture. Again, those ideas are implemented or they're understood as to why they aren't implemented, why it doesn't work with the culture. That helps someone understand how they're supposed to fit in with your studio culture. The project and studio has a low turnover rate. So turnover is defined by roles you have to refill. So not someone leaving because the contract has ended and you don't need that work done anymore, which was ideally agreed upon nice and early and everyone was on the same page. This is people, if you have a lot of turnover in, say, a particular junior code role, think about who is in that, who's the lead for that area and what could be going on in that department. There's a documented onboarding process for new team members, so not just your employees but also your contractors. Anyone who becomes involved with the project has an idea of how they start to engage with the team and engage with the game. Team members have clear and concise job roles and boundaries. Both of these are important. And assess these regularly, probably. If people are starting to bleed across and pick up other hats, we tend to do an indie development, you need to formalize that and you need to check, is that person okay doing that amount of work? Because when you take on more hats, you're just taking on more and more work and more context switching. Working overtime is unusual. I don't want to say I originally had this, I was working overtime, just don't do it. But there are times when you do want to do overtime, but it should be unusual. And importantly, if we just jump down a little bit, it should have really quick time in lieu taken out of it. So if you have some people who work kind of regular overtime, but they don't take that, they just accrue this time and they don't take it, that's a sign they feel like they just have to keep working. People should be able to feel like they can just step back at any time and take a break as they need to. And similarly, directors in leadership and production don't work overtime, or they do very little overtime. I think there's another point I have this in a little bit about this, but it's not even a sentence. There's a point I have this in a... I'm broken. There's a point I have in a couple, I think the next section, but there's if your directors and your leadership are not doing well, that is a reflection of them potentially trying to protect the rest of the team or just setting a really bad example for the rest of the team. So that's its own separate bullet point. Okay, this I call management bandwidth, and this is kind of like the health check of your producers and your leadership. Like I just mentioned as that last bullet point, if your producers are not doing well, if your leadership is not doing well, if they're burning out, that's a really good sign that the whole team has some bigger problems going on. Please have more producers, please hire more producers, please. I'm glad everybody has producers now, but like part-time producers on a 5 to 6 person team, no, you need more. You need a full-time producer or more. Really think about that number. How can you get as many production people as you can? And if you're not sure if you need it, just like, is your producer working overtime at all, ever? If they are, you need more producers. You will need to ramp up your producers as you ramp up contractors and external engagement. So if we think about when you're approaching ship and you're like, oh, we'll just hire some more people to solve this problem, you need to also be hiring more producers. You can't just be hiring, like, porting people with no one to manage them and look after them. You can kind of, as I talked about, I'm exchanging production and lead in, very much on this slide, but if you have a lead who you're treating as a producer for the purpose of this checklist, they need to have dedicated lead time. If they still have a regular, normal content code production workload, then they're not really able to do any kind of management work. And in fact, their team is going to struggle because they don't have time to look after them, and it's just going to make everyone burn out. And I like to think of producers and these kind of leadership roles as canaries in the coal mine. So if they're doing poorly, if you have a really high turnover of producers, for example, to me that's a really clear flag for like there's a serious problem with the management of this team or this project. Checklist, pretty much what I talked about. The only thing I didn't maybe mention is like the external relations. So if you have lots of external relations, like if you're going to hire a QA company or a reporting company or whatever else, that's not like free. Someone needs to manage that, right? So think about who's managing it and where that time is going, where that kind of time is coming from, I should say. And then you've maintained this list, this amount of production and management since early stages of development, so since pre-production, since production. As I mentioned, I come on really late stage, and the point that I join a lot of these projects, it's very hard to make changes because you're already in that kind of like panic state where you're like, oh, I've only got so much money, we've got to get the game out the door. And at that stage, there's already this kind of like production debt, I would call it, that's accrued, that's very hard to pay off. So if you have really good production health, you'll have probably good production health, good health going all the way through. Playtesting, yay. So when I talk about playtesting, I mean external playtesting with the target audience, so not internal playtests. I don't really like the term internal playtests. I like internal reviews. You're reviewing the game as a team, you're not playtesting it. Playtesting is done with your target audience, with people who will actually play your game out in the real world, who don't know anything about the development process of it. They test and prove your design and content hypothesis. So if you're mid-production and you've got some mechanics that are being made, like you can use your playtest to prove it. This is de-risking your game. It's showing hidden information, so you're revealing secrets about your game that you need to know to schedule. It also confirms sometimes which areas are complete enough. So a playtest we did with Wayward Strand was to work out are the visuals at a quality people are happy with, so that we could then put pens down on the art assets. And they can also prove and test and prove your audience hypothesis. So if you think you have a certain kind of audience member, you can use playtesting to kind of work out if actually they like the game in the way you think they will. And it also allows the team, this is probably the most important thing, it allows the team to see the forest for the trees. It's like an inversion of that. Oh, you're just seeing the trees for the forest. They can see the forest through the playtester's eyes. So it lets your team step back and look at the big picture of the game and work out what's really important and kind of reimagine, or not just rescope, but like reprioritize and kind of refocus themselves into the things that are really important. Particularly during shipping, I think this is really, this idea of stepping back and looking at the artifact of the game itself, like stepping back from task lists every now and again and just looking at the artifact and being like, what is good in this game and what is not so good in this game, is really quite important. So for the checklist, pretty much the things I was talking about, you're playtesting regularly, you've been playtesting with people who are actually from your target audience, not just like random family members or something like that. You're not just playtesting at PAX, for example. Do playtest with, as best as you can get people playing in the real situation that would play your game. And you've also documented and discussed and prioritized and converted all these playtest things into issues. You're not having playtests and then doing nothing about it. I've seen that happen before. Just action it. And I'm counting this in playtesting, but it is really its whole own topic. Accessibility consultation has been engaged to test your game at multiple development stages. So from the get-go, you're doing accessibility consultation and getting reports. Same thing for cultural and sensitivity consultation. So you're doing that throughout your whole development process. And again, you've looked at those reports and you've actioned them. You haven't sat on them or thought about them. You've actioned them, and then you've ideally had reconsultation to see if what you did has improved the game. through the eyes of those consultants, or if you're playtesting with people from, with different accessibility needs and stuff like that. Okay, whew. QA. Who's doing QA? Yes. Oh, good, okay. I had a little fear, I'm like, what if no one puts a hand up? Okay, so QA for the check, I'm just going straight into checklist now because we don't need to waffle on. There's already an established QA process. So if you've already started doing QA and you're in production, fantastic. Like you might be doing it just for your milestone build or something, but just start that QA process really early so your team gets used to it. I'm putting checklist items for doing gameplay and code features, and then also doing your kind of content features separately. So you've locked your code and you've QA'd them, you've locked your gameplay and your content and stuff like this, and that's been QA'd. Your platforms have been QA'd. Your low-end devices have been QA'd, so you've looked at like the worst possible device you can find and you've done QA on that, and that has come through okay. Separate to profiling, different to profiling, QA it. You're going to have different impacts potentially if you have, I don't know, some bad code in there that's like frame rate dependent or something. There's a QA plan for the lead up to launch. Please, you've got a QA plan, you're doing QA. There's sufficient time for that QA plan. So you've got, I like to say like at least 2 months between like content lock and release candidate, but this might be larger depending on the scale of the game you're making. So you have lots of time between when the game is content locked and you're just polishing it. You've got your QA cycle in place, and now you've got like your kind of, hopefully your live ready candidate or your goal candidate, hopeful candidate, and you're submitting that into certification. Localization QA is scheduled, your platform certification QA is scheduled if you're doing that, and there's a QA plan for post-relaunch patches and content. So your QA doesn't stop at launch, it keeps going, particularly if you know you're going to have any bugs or updates or anything else going on. Don't drop it at that point, then you'll just end up with other bugs in your game later on. Yes? Tech. I think I've got to power through these a little bit more, so I have time for questions. How are we all going? We're going okay? Great, okay, good, okay. Tech, okay. Like I said, I was a lead programmer at one point, so I have a little bee in my bonnet about some of this stuff. Tech debt is known and accounted for. We all have tech debt. It's there, hiding under the sheets. You've accounted for it, right? So just knowing which parts of your code are going to be problematic to change, which parts will be okay. You know, you've done your optimization checking, you do regular profiling. I like to say you have at least 2 team members who have looked over the certification checklist for each platform. So that's one technical person and one production person. The technical person will understand the implementation problems, the production person will understand the scheduling problems. And you know the build time for all your platforms, and they're as automated as much as possible. So not all indie teams have the capacity for like build pipelines and stuff like this, but I would say, you know, to satisfy that bullet point, it's kind of like you've thought about what the cost of that would be, and you've decided to either make a build machine or take the cost of however long it takes to make a build manually. Risk. It's a bit of a catch-all for some big things. You have an up-to-date risk register. If you don't have a formal risk register, I'm counting a risk register as a list of risks. Sorry. Ideally with some severity and ideally with some sense of what you're doing about those risks. All areas of development ownership have some technical documentation. So, you know, if you have a tech art pipeline that works in a particular way, there is documentation for it. And this documentation can be understood by someone who's unfamiliar or new to the project. So they've just joined and they're like, oh, I need to do something in this particular area of the game. And they can find the documentation, they can read it, they can understand it, and then they can try and make that change. And the project has a high bus factor. So if you've heard of this, it's the idea that it's like the number of people who need to be hit by a bus for your project to fall over. So a high bus factor, it's really grim. I don't know, like what's wrong with the producers and project managers? Why do they come up with such a grim metric? This just means, you know, if you have some area of the code that like one person is like nursing and not letting anyone else touch, you have a high bus factor. If you have a creative director who still has the vision of the end of the game in their head, that's a high bus factor. It's a bus factor of 1, sorry, a low bus factor. Low bus factor of 1, really bad. One person needs to disappear in order for this game to fall over. Okay, everyone who wears multiple hats has additional time for in the schedule for context switching, particularly if they're doing a kind of production or management or any kind of or community management role, anything that is like a time-sensitive kind of role where they have to just switch out of their other roles into this time-sensitive role. They will need extra time because they're going to be doing that ad hoc and it's just constantly going to distract them from their other hats. I really like directors and leads to have really minimal hands-on development tasks. It's not always possible, but a lot of the worst time estimates I see come from directors. They're like, oh, I'm going to get that content done in the next 3 days. And then it's like 3 weeks later and you're like, what's going on here? And external partners, this is a really important one actually. External partners are risk managed internally. So if you're like, oh, we'll hire a QA company to do that, or a reporting company, or our publisher's going to do this marketing, you have internally gone, what are the risks that could happen with trusting these people? And it's not to say you shouldn't trust people, but maybe actually in production is to say you shouldn't trust people. Always do that scenario planning. What could possibly go wrong? How badly could they fall over? Because they do fall over. As much as you want to believe, that's that optimism hat, right? As much as you want to believe that things will go well, they can go wrong, so plan for it, otherwise you're going to have a really bad time. Okay, miscellaneous scheduling stuff I just wanted to mention but didn't really fit anywhere else. There's dedicated time for audio mastering. If you have like cinematics in your game, it's not like you content lock when the cinematic is done. You've got to give audio time to put in the sound effects and put in the voiceover and put in all the bits and pieces. Like, please give audio time. It's audio and QA who always kind of bite the bullet when we run late on our schedule. So think of audio, think of QA, because they're the ones who are going to get a little bit stooged. Platform certification, just in case you want this data, like I say, 2 or 3 submissions at least, and so time for the submission itself, and then also time between those submissions, enough time to fix the serious things that might come back from it. That's a good buffer. More than that is great. Less than that, you're starting to go into that risk zone. And don't forget your content ratings for each release region. So they can take, depending on what region it is, it can take any number of months to get that done. So work out that stuff early and have it planned and have it in your schedule. Launch prep. Okay, so the next couple ones are like, they're kind of post-release things or like launch things, but they are, you're planning them now so that you know what to do later when that happens. So even though this is a talk on, like you're doing it in the shipping phase, you're doing all this work to plan for your release. This isn't stuff that you do after release. I mean, you do, but you plan for it now. Hope that makes sense. Launch prep, okay, big list of stuff. I don't think I really need to go through it. This is just stuff you got to do. Make sure it's scheduled. Everyone got a photo? Yeah, 3, 2, 1, boom. Okay, scenario planning. I really love scenario planning. Okay, so this is, I talked about it a little bit with money and financials right at the beginning, but it isn't just financial. It's also what happens if your game is a huge commercial success, or sorry, a huge critical success, or a huge cultural success. What does it mean if some target audience you didn't expect? You thought they'll be like your tertiary target audience, they go absolutely wild with it. So think about the different ways you can have success and failure. Like an example of this might be, say you have really poor financial success, but really great cultural success. How are you going to fly your team members over to the BAFTAs to accept that BAFTA, right? Because not accepting that BAFTA is going to break everybody's heart. Predetermine the metrics for this. So again, you don't want to be thinking when you get to release. Don't be like, oh, if we do well, this is what we'll do. You need to be very much like, if we get 100,000 sales, here's what will happen. If we have less than 2,000 sales, here's what will happen, right? So work out the metrics for this. Maybe you could use, like, it doesn't have to be sales, it could be anything, but have those metrics so you don't have to think about it. And in this process, think about your post-launch content. So I've touched on that earlier as well, but things like, if you have 100,000 sales, how are your servers handling? How much money has to go into that? And where's the cash flow for that coming from? So these can be quite meaty when you get into them, but at least start doing the basics of that now, and then you will have an idea of what to do when you get to it. I kind of talked over this as the same points I just said. If anyone wants to get a photo, you can do that. I'll give you 3 seconds. 2, 1, go. All right, studio. So now we're kind of going into the big picture of what is your studio plan. We think when we talk about like a first kind of indie game is coming out, you're like, oh, it's this game, and you're really game focused. You do need to step back and think about what is your studio doing, right? Because that allows you to have the vision to see how your game fits into the context of the larger studio vision. So think about the next steps for your studio, know how that relates to your different scenario planning. So say you only get 2,000 sales, you're going to shut down the company. That's your plan. That's what's happening to the studio. If you get over 50,000 sales, you're going to try and make a vertical slice from something and get publishing from a local funding body. If you get 200,000 sales, you're going to go and do this other cool thing and make your own really big scale game. Whatever your plan is, scaling up your studio, whatever it is, have those baked into your scenario plan so you know what your studio is doing based on your success scenarios or your failure scenarios. You have team members from all ranges. Everybody basically should understand what is happening with their contracts, please. If you have a team member who is not sure what is happening after release, they've been working with you, they're going through all this, hopefully not crunch, but they're going through this shipping process, you're working really closely together, you have a great rapport, and then the game launches, and that person is like, now, where's my contract, like what happens? Do I work more? Are we done? Is the game going to shut down? Like, is the studio going to shut down? Is the studio going to continue? Be really clear about that. So those next steps for your studio, communicate them to all of your team members, including your contractors, and again, apply those metrics so they know and they have visibility on the sales numbers, and they can then make their own decisions about what they want to do. Enable them to make the decisions they need for their own financial security and for their own career and professional security. And of course, if you have people working post-launch in those scenarios, have retainers and contracts in place for that, right? You don't want to have your main programmer disappear immediately after launch, and then who fixes the bugs because you have a bus ratio of 1. Okay, post-launch team and care. This is really important as well. You've all heard of the launch blues, I assume. So your game comes out and all of this hype, all of this like bustle from shipping the game dissipates. It's gone out, it's out in the world, people are playing it, you're getting reviews, some of them are good, some of them are bad. Be aware of this and have a plan for it. So keep busy, stay in touch, and plan it all before launch. Don't wait until launch to do it. I keep repeating the same thing, but like plan this before launch so that when you're in launch and you're in this panic zone, you don't have to think. The brain can't think properly when we're panicking and when we're busy. All right, so checklist for this. Have a launch celebration. We all do that pretty consistently. Very happy with that. Have some kind of launch celebration. If you don't have a lot of money, just have a little gathering on the grass. Do something small. Doesn't have to be a big thing. Make a cool down plan for the team. So think about blanket rules that you have researched that will look after your team members. So, watch streams, don't read the reviews, whatever that might be. Think about what will be healthy for your team if you're in the context of your game. Each team member should be given the time and support to craft their own post-launch care plan. So what do they think they need to look after themselves? What friends are they talking to? Are they going to go visit some family up in near a beach and go hang out and vacation for a little while? Whatever that is, give that person the agency to help you craft that with them. Don't just tell them what they're doing. Try to keep regular non-launch related social activities going. So if you just continually kind of have meetings about the game and about the launch, it kind of might keep them stuck in that shipping zone. But if you have other social activities planned, just whether it's another project, work project, or if it's just completely non-work stuff, just have some things in there so people are keeping in touch and not losing a connection to each other because you have gone through a really intense time together shipping this game. And I would like to say just don't cold turkey vacation time, right? Don't launch and then have everyone leave. That just feels really bad, and that's a really great way to make your team dissipate into the woods. And if it's appropriate, if your team wants to, discuss the next thing that you're going to be doing. So is it DLC for this project? And it's to do with your scenarios as well, right? Is it DLC? Is it going to be a game? Give them something else to think about that is not just this project, that will keep them kind of ticking along if they want to, spread their creative fingers. Oh, we did it! Yay! Okay, still a tiny bit more. Almost done. You were clapping, you were like, oh, thank God, it's over. Okay, it's okay, this bit's quick. All right, so we now know our dragons. Those are our dragons in our ocean. If we know where they are, we can avoid them. We can dodge them. So what can you do about it? Number 1, act earlier. All of you here who are not yet in shipping, fantastic. I'm so glad you are here. Now you're informed, I hope, with some information that will enable you to start mitigating some of these problems. Rescope your project. That's one of the easiest things we can do. Just do less. Make less of a game. Make it smaller. Remove some features. You might be like, oh, I don't want to cut that. Your players will never know. It's fine. Delaying the game. I talked about time being a huge factor. Just delay it. If you've done that cost risk of what does it mean to move our window later, if you've done that analysis, then you can do that with confidence. Hire additional production support. Production support or additional team members. As I mentioned before, you can't just keep on ramping up technical team members or hands-on development team members without having the management to support them. And likewise, you need to have the onboarding structure for this as well. So this is an option, but you need to be careful about how you do it. You can't just throw people at the problem. It doesn't work that way. Finding more cash, a challenge, but in teams I've worked with, they have done this. They've been like, this is the position we're at. Hey, publisher, hey, platform holder, hey, investor, can we just have some money? We just need this much for these reasons to de-risk this. There might be repercussions on it, but will those repercussions be worse than shipping a game that goes really rocky and having a team dissipate? You make that decision. Improve your production processes, also free, as long as you have the producer space to do it. Giving your producer time to step back and look at their processes and think about the way they can improve what they're doing. It's basically a freebie, right? Things like the creative cohesion stuff I talked about, having meetings where everyone's able to articulate and like play the game together and then articulate their opinions on it. Brings the team together, and it's just free to do. You can just do it. I will put this checklist online after. I'll post it on Twitter after this, so you can review all the items in the checklist. Some of them are actionable, which means you can actually just go, oh, we need to have a risk register. Just go make it. Done. Step back and look at the studio big picture. That will help you refocus. I've mentioned that already. And then talk to other teams. Look at each other. All of you are here trying to ship. People in other rooms have already shipped. I think probably many people in here have already shipped. Talk to each other, work out what worked well. No one game is the same, no one team is the same. So just listen to stories and figure out which pitfalls you think you might need to be avoiding. And accept that sometimes it's just going to be a bit rough. And you just want to do everything you can to look out for each other in that case. So number one, protect your team. Always protect your team first. Look after yourself and look after your team. Okay, final bit. This has been a little bit of an intense talk, right? How are we feeling? Are we like, yeah, I'm motivated? Or are you like, oh no, shipping? Can we get a little bit of, okay, a couple, good, great. So I do want to remind you, I said earlier, my nickname was a games midwife. The implication of this is, if I'm a games midwife, you're all giving birth. You're all making a small game baby and you're giving it out to the world. And that is huge. That is a monumental thing to do. So give yourself a break. I don't know if anyone on planet Earth has had a pleasant birth process, pleasant labour process. So be aware it is going to be hard at times and just do everything you can to make it not harmful to you and to give your game the best shot it can and to give your studio the best shot you can. So I'm saying use pessimism as a tool. It's not a state of being. Don't be pessimistic all the time. Keep it with a balance of optimism. So put on your dirtbag producer hat sometimes, and then take it off and be optimistic and be happy about it. I really love this quote from Leonardo da Vinci that says, "Art is never finished, only abandoned." I think we can probably all feel this way when we shipped a game. Was it really finished? I don't know, but we've done it and it's gone. It's out there. It's in the world. Remember that every game is a miracle. And as I've said a few times, no video game is worth your health. We're not like saving the world with our games. We're just making video games. So look after yourself first, and then your games, your art practice comes second. Thank you. So I think we are out of time. Is that correct, Crispy? One question. Do we have any one lucky question? Yes. Jump up there. Yeah.
So my current project is in late pre-prod, and our pre-prod has like a closing phase very similar to shipping a game. Do you think that this checklist could be used at other phases of development? Oh,
that's a really good question. I think a lot of the creative cohesion, you could probably go through it and be like, this seems like it's applicable and this doesn't seem like it's applicable. Like, is QA required at that stage? Like, yeah, probably start a process, but it doesn't need to be like, do we have certification QA? Does it run on platforms? Maybe not at that point. But certainly things like creative cohesion. Is your team talking to each other? Is everyone healthy? Is everyone comfortable with the work culture? That kind of stuff I think is really applicable. Yeah. One more? Okay. Yeah, please.
Do you think this could apply for like big teams? Like I work at UB now, so like it's a big change from indie. So do you think it could apply to like a large scale thing?
Yeah, it's a really good question as well. So for context, the scale which my experience is coming from is like your small teams from like, let's say 5 or 6 up to like maybe 12 people. And then working at Media Molecule on like maybe a 20-person team and then like a 60-person team. So I think there's a lot of stuff in here that's very specific to indie and small teams, but I think you can draw out the heart of that idea and apply that at a larger scale as well. Yeah. It might just not be the exact checklist. Good, awesome. Thank you so much for attending my talk. Oh, and if you want the checklist, I will put it on Twitter. So follow me, like and subscribe.